I was splitting wood at first light when the line went down across the road. A crack, a hum dropping to nothing, and my neighbor's house went dark all at once. Lights, heat, charging station, gone. He pays $200 a month for that power and was helpless before his coffee finished. I've been without grid power before, by weather and by choice. I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was what I felt the first time I touched a solar panel, and what that neighbor said to me 6 months later, standing on my porch in the dark. Stick around. I want to be honest about something before I start. For most of my life, I thought solar power was for a certain kind of person, not me. The kind of person who lives in a city suburb with a mortgage broker and a homeowners association and a contractor on speed dial. The kind of person who reads brochures. I figured it was expensive, fragile, complicated, something you'd need a licensed crew to install and an engineering degree to understand. That's what I assumed for about 30 years. And I was wrong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing you need to understand is that my relationship with the power grid was never what you'd call trusting. I've got about 800 feet of line running from the road up to the house, and every ice storm that comes through these mountains has a shot at taking it down. 3 times last winter, 3 separate outages in 3 months, and every single one of them needed a utility crew to come out and fix it from the outside, which means I'm standing there waiting on somebody else to restore what I'm paying for. There's a propane setup for heat and cooking, but even propane requires an electric igniter. You don't have power, you've got cold iron and a sparker. Not the worst situation in the world, but not independence either. The power bill was tacked to the kitchen wall. I'd circled the amount, which I won't tell you because it'll make you uncomfortable or it'll make me sound soft, but it was circled. Ice on the line outside. The nearest utility substation is about 12 miles by road, and when something goes wrong between here and there, the repair priority is set by the number of customers affected, not by how long it's been out or how cold it is. I've had a crew show up on day 3, and I've had them show up on day 1. You don't know which you're getting until you know. That was my starting condition. I'd been irritated about it for years, but irritation without action is just a habit. Something changed last February that moved me out of irritated and into actually looking into it. My cousin lives 2 ridges over. She's got less mechanical experience than I do. That's not a knock, it's just the truth. And she mentioned one evening that she'd done her own solar setup over a weekend. No contractor, no loan, no permit chase. I didn't believe her. I drove over and looked at it. A panel on a pole mount in the yard, angled south, wired through a small controller into 2 batteries sitting on a shelf in the barn. A single bare bulb running off that setup. When I asked her when she'd lost power, she said she hadn't. Not during the last 3 outages. Not during the stretch when the road was out for 4 days. I poked at the wiring. I looked for the flaw. I asked hard questions about what happens when it's overcast. What happens when the battery drains. What happens in a hard freeze. She answered all of it. Not with a brochure, with what she'd actually seen. And I drove home with an uncomfortable thought sitting on the seat beside me. If she figured this out over a weekend, and the lights stayed on when mine didn't, my excuse was gone. I've never been comfortable with excuses I can't defend. Here's what I want you to sit with for a second before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes next. Every tool I've ever trusted, I came to through skepticism first. The chainsaw, the pressure canner, even cast iron, which my grandmother used, and I didn't pick up until I was past 40 and had to be shown why it was worth the wait. The instinct up here isn't to reject new things. It's to demand that they prove themselves in real conditions before you depend on them. That's a different thing from stubbornness. I was about to apply that same standard to solar, and what I found surprised me. Before I bought a single part, I learned that there are basically 3 different ways to build a solar system, and 2 of them are traps. I went home and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started reading. Real reading. Not advertisements, not product pages, not forums full of people selling you enthusiasm. Technical basics. And the first thing I found out was that solar is not one thing. There are 3 different system types, and they behave completely differently when the grid goes out. The first type is grid tied. That's what most people picture when they hear solar house. Panels on the roof, electricity feeding back to the utility. Sounds like independence. What it actually is, the moment the grid goes down, the system shuts itself off. Not because the panel stopped working, because of a safety requirement. If your inverter keeps pushing power into deadlines while a utility crew is out there working on them, somebody gets killed. So the law requires the system to disconnect. The expensive solar house goes dark with the grid. Same problem, different price tag. The second type is hybrid, a grid-tied system with a battery backup bolted on. Closer to real resilience but expensive, and most of the setup requires a licensed installer because you're integrating with the utility connection. That's not a weekend project. That's a contractor, permits, and a number I didn't want to write on my legal pad. The third type is off-grid standalone. Panel to charge controller to battery bank to inverter to outlet. 5 components, no utility connection, no contract, no crew. You size it to what you actually need, you install it yourself, and it works whether the grid is up or not, because it has nothing to do with the grid. I drew 3 boxes on the legal pad and crossed out 2 of them. Then I wrote, what do I actually need to power? That question turned out to be more interesting than I expected. I'd been thinking big. I want to run the house. Refrigerator, water heater, electric range, the works. That number is large enough to require a serious investment, and it kept me from thinking smaller and more honestly. So I wrote down only the essential list: lights at night, phone and radio charging, the box fan in summer. That was the actual list of things that, if I had them during an outage, I could function without hardship. I totaled the wattage and multiplied by hours per day. That's when I found out the first thing that genuinely surprised me about all of this. The total was less than 200 watt hours per day. Not 2,000, not 500, under 200, with margin. I stared at that number for a while. I'd been afraid of a big number my whole time thinking about this, and the real number fit on half a page of a legal pad. That's the load audit. You make the list. You look up the wattage on each device. You multiply by how many hours you run it each day. You add them up. That's the size of system you actually need, not the size of system that would be nice. The size you actually need. I want to pause here because there's something in that arithmetic worth naming. Every skill I know that actually works under pressure is about storage, not just about harvest. You don't just catch rain, you put it up. You don't just hunt, you preserve what you take. You don't just cut wood, you season it and stack it before you need it. The panel in a solar setup is the harvest. The battery is the root cellar. People talk about solar in terms of the panel, but the panel is just the front end. The whole system is really a question of how much you've got stored when the sky closes in. I'll tell you what my system cost before we're done. But first, I need to tell you what I found when I actually laid hands on the hardware, because it wasn't what I was picturing. A 100-watt panel is lighter than a bag of livestock feed. I didn't expect that. I've been handling heavy equipment my whole life, and I was braced for something awkward. A fragile glass sheet that would crack if you said it wrong. What I picked up was solid, not particularly heavy, and the connections on the back were color-coded the same way jumper cables are. Red to red, black to black, nothing proprietary, nothing that required a special tool or a specific technical understanding to hook up. The panel is a sealed unit, no moving parts, nothing to maintain, nothing to adjust, nothing that wears out in the normal sense. It sits in the sun and converts light to voltage. That's the whole job. Output depends on sun angle and whether there's shade hitting it, not on anything you can do wrong. I set the first one against the porch rail to test it. Sun came over the ridge, hit the face of the panel, and I touched the multimeter leads to the terminals. Voltage right there in the reading. The hardest part of installing the panel was figuring out the mount, and that's the same problem as hanging a heavy gate on a post. I've hung a few gates in my time. I wasn't intimidated by that. The part I'd been quietly nervous about was the wiring. I'll be direct about that. Electrical work has a reputation, and it's partly earned. But here's what I didn't understand before I started. The DC side of a small off-grid system runs on 12 or 24 volts. A 12-volt shock is unpleasant, but it will not stop your heart. The real danger in low-voltage DC wiring isn't shock. It's heat. Undersized wire or a loose connection under load will get warm and eventually catch. That's a real risk, and it's why wire gauge matters and why you put a fuse between the battery and everything downstream. One fuse, correct gauge wire, secure terminals. That's the whole safety protocol for the DC side. The charge controller sits between the panel and the battery and does the only job that requires any thinking. It makes sure the battery doesn't get overcharged or drained too deep, both of which shorten a battery's life considerably. A decent PWM controller costs less than $30. A better MPPT controller extracts more power in low light conditions and costs more. But for a small system, either works. I used a PWM. The controller has indicator lights, green for charging, another for battery state. You can read the system at a glance the way you'd read a gauge on a piece of farm equipment. The AC side, what comes out of the inverter, is standard household current, the same as what's in your walls. I treated it the same way I'd treat any outlet. I didn't open the inverter. I plugged things into it. That's no different than running a generator, which I'd done for years. I've wired outbuildings before. Low voltage DC wiring was easier than that. What I felt when I first ran the full circuit, panel to controller to battery to inverter, everything connected, a light coming on, wasn't pride exactly. It was more like the feeling when a tool that should work turns out to actually work. A quiet satisfaction that comes from having been right about a thing being simpler than its reputation. But the battery question was still in front of me, and that's where most people make the expensive mistake. Let me explain something before I go further, because it applies to every part of what I'm describing. The weakness in any system, in equipment, in plans, in other people's promises, shows up when you need it, and it isn't there. Grid-tied solar wasn't there when the grid wasn't there. A generator that won't start in a cold snap isn't there when you need it. A battery bank sized for your wishes instead of your actual load runs out overnight and isn't there in the morning. The old understanding of self-reliance was never about having the most gear. It was about knowing exactly what you needed and making sure what you had covered it without gaps. Modern design tends toward abundance. More storage, more features, more capacity. The mountain understanding is different. What is the minimum that actually works? And do I have that minimum covered completely? I'd answered the minimum load question. Now I needed to match the battery to it. Under 200 watt-hours per day. A 100 amp-hour lithium battery at 12 volts holds 1200 watt-hours of capacity, with a working range, the portion you can actually use without shortening its life, of somewhere around 800 to 1000 watt-hours. That's 4 to 5 days of my essential load before the panel tops it back up. One battery, one panel for most of the year. In deep winter, I added a second panel because the sun angle is shallow and the days are short, and I wanted the buffer. The total parts cost for phase 1, one panel, a charge controller, one battery, a small inverter, wire, fuse block, connectors, came in under $600. I did not finance it. I did not hire anyone. It took me the better part of a weekend and one additional morning to tighten everything down and verify the connections. Phase 2, which I'm building toward now, adds a chest freezer. That's a bigger draw, but a modern, efficient chest freezer running in a cool shed uses surprisingly little power over the course of a day. Another panel, another battery, modest expansion on a modest foundation. The point is, you don't have to do it all at once. You start with the essential load and you build from there. Same way you'd add onto a homestead, one solid thing at a time. The generator sat in the corner of the shed under a tarp with the pull cord hanging loose. I hadn't touched it in 4 months. It's still there, back up to the backup. But the maintenance schedule, the gas cans, the oil changes, the cold morning anxiety about whether it would start or not, all of that dropped out of my life. The solar system has no moving parts. In winter, it charges when the sun is out. It powers what I need when the sun isn't. The generator used to be my one line of defense. Now it's a last resort I'm glad to have, but genuinely expect never to need. The old value up here isn't refusing technology. That's how it gets described from the outside, but that's not quite right. The value is refusing dependency. Refusing to be in a position where something outside your control, maintained by someone else, owned by a company somewhere, has to work in order for you to be okay. The man who hauls water from the creek isn't wiser than the man who drills a well. The man who controls his own water is. What I had done with this solar system, without quite planning it that way, was drill my own well. Then February came back around and proved it. The ice storm that hit was a hard one. Lines down across 3 roads, power out for 4 days, temperatures staying below freezing the whole stretch. I went out the first morning and knocked the ice off the panel face with a soft broom, which took about a minute and brought the output back up. That's the only maintenance required during a winter storm. Keep the face clear, which isn't different from any other surface you need to stay functional. The week before the storm, we'd had cold, clear days, sun low but present, and the battery was full going into the outage. Cloudy days during a storm still produce some output, roughly 10 to 25% of rated capacity, which isn't much, but it's something. More importantly, cold weather actually improves panel efficiency. Photovoltaic panels generate more power per unit of sunlight at lower temperatures than at summer peak. That was something I hadn't expected. The heat of July is harder on a panel than the cold of February, all else being equal. The key design decision I'd made was to size for essential loads, not peak loads, which meant the draw on the battery each night was modest. 4 days. The system ran the whole thing without issue. My neighbor across the road spent day 2 of the outage running an extension cord from his truck to charge his phone. I watched him do it from my porch, where I had a light on. He was burning fuel to charge a phone. I had lights, charge devices, weather updates, and a working radio the entire time. The phone mattered more than the light. Charged phone meant I could reach family when the road was out, get weather updates, know when the storm was supposed to break. That's not comfort, that's information, and information in a situation like that is what you make decisions with. On day 3, he came over. I want to tell you about that conversation because it's the payoff to something I promised at the start, and it lands differently than I expected it to when I was first thinking about this. My neighbor is a stubborn man, which I respect, and he'd given me a hard time about the solar setup when I was putting it in. Nothing mean about it, just the comfortable skepticism of a man who's seen plenty of things that looked good on paper fail in practice. He'd made a remark about it being a city person's hobby. I hadn't argued with him because you can't argue a man into understanding something he hasn't seen work yet. He came up the porch steps in the dark, 3 days into the outage, and I handed him a cup of coffee. He stood there for a moment, looking at the light on in the kitchen. Then he said, "Where did you get those panels? Not can I run an extension cord over here. Not can I borrow your setup. Where did you get the panels?" He wanted to know how to do it himself. First time in the years I'd known him that he'd asked me for advice instead of offering a counter-argument. I told him everything. The load audit, the 3 system types, the parts list, the wire gauge, the fuse placement. He stood there in the dark, listening like a man hearing something he'd needed to hear for a while. He ordered his parts the following week. Take a second with what that means. If one house has a working solar setup and keeps the knowledge to itself, the neighborhood is still fragile. 4 out of 5 households still go dark in a 4-day outage. But if one house proves it works and one man tells 4 others how to do it, those 5 households become a different kind of community. Not in a dramatic or political sense, just in the plain practical sense that 5 households with lights, charged phones, and preserved food weather the same outage differently than 5 households where one has those things and 4 don't. Every skill I've ever trusted to pass along, putting up food, reading weather, keeping an edge on a tool, works the same way. You learn it, you use it, you show someone else. That's not charity. That's how knowledge stays alive and useful. Every skill I know that's actually worked when it mattered, reading the weather from the ridge, keeping a knife sharp, putting food up before winter, is a way of staying capable when what's outside my control fails. I've been adding entries to that ledger my whole life. Solar is just the newest one. The difference between a skill that stays useful and one that dies out is whether the person who knows it teaches it or keeps it to himself. My grandfather didn't keep his seed-saving method private. That would have been foolish. The method wasn't useful unless more people were using it. What I'd been wrong wrong about for 30 years wasn't solar. I'd been wrong about what self-sufficiency meant. I had it defined as doing everything alone, needing no one, keeping my systems to myself as proof that I was managing. But that's not self-sufficiency. That's isolation dressed up as independence. Real self-sufficiency is the capacity to solve a problem yourself, combined with the willingness to pass the solution along. The neighborhood that survived the week was the one where the knowledge traveled. I walked my neighbor's property the next dry morning and showed him where to put the panel. South-facing slope, clear of the tree line, good angle for winter sun. He asked the same hard questions I had asked. I answered them the same way my cousin had answered mine. 2 months later, his lights were on. He called me when he first ran the circuit, which I thought was a good sign. Not to ask for help, just to say it worked. The satisfaction in his voice was the same thing I'd felt. At some point, the light on in his window is going to be the reason somebody else asks him the same question. That's how this is supposed to work, and it always has been. Knowledge that moves is knowledge that stays alive. The next February, a neighbor I'd never traded advice with before flagged me down on the road and asked if I knew anything about solar. I told him I knew a little. Before the next bad winter hits your area, sit down with a piece of paper and do one load audit. Just one. Write down every device you genuinely need to keep running in an emergency. Not what you'd like, what you need, and look up the wattage on each one. Multiply by hours per day. Add it up. That number is probably smaller than you think, and it's the number that tells you exactly what size system you need and roughly what it's going to cost. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to commit to anything. Just know the number. Once you know it, the rest of the research follows naturally. The same way any job gets clearer once you've measured what you're working with. That's the starting point. That's what I should have done 10 years ago instead of assuming the number was too big to face. What would you keep running if the grid went out for a week? Put it in the comments. I'm curious what the actual list looks like for people in different situations, and I'll bet the honest answers are a lot shorter than people expect. Knowledge of what's actually possible is the first tool you need. It weighs nothing, needs no fuel, and it works on the darkest morning of the year.